The quiet tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was the loudest sound I usually heard. That, and the chirping of the birds in the ancient oak that shaded my porch. I traded the roar of engines and the stink of gasoline for the gentle rhythm of suburban life. Most days, anyway, at my house, nestled on a cul-de-sac in what some might call an aggressively manicured community, was my sanctuary, the place where I could finally exhale after years of living life in the RED. It wasn't a mansion by any means, just a modest two-story with a decent-sized yard, a well-worn porch swing, and a rose garden I was particularly proud of. Inside, I'd filled it with the things I loved. Comfortable, slightly mismatched furniture, stacks of well-loved books, and the faint scent of lavender from the diffuser I kept running. The walls were painted a calming shade of blue, a stark contrast to the fiery landscapes I used to frequent that I'd spent years building this peaceful existence. Years trying to bury the ghosts of my past under a veneer of normalcy. I attended neighborhood barbecues, though I still felt a little awkward making small talk about lawn care, volunteered at the local library, and even joined a book club, which mostly involved drinking wine and gossiping. But I digress. That I even, against my better judgment, meticulously followed the HOA guidelines, keeping my lawn trimmed, my hedges sculpted, and my Christmas lights tastefully arranged. The truth was, I liked the quiet. I liked the routine. After years of chaos and uncertainty, the predictability of suburban life was a balm to my soul. It was a way to prove to myself that I could change, that I could leave the old life behind, that I was worthy of this peace. But there were days, I admit, when the silence was deafening, when the perfectly manicured lawn seemed suffocating, when I caught a glimpse of my reflection and saw the faint lines etched around my eyes. A roadmap of a life lived on the edge. Those were the days when I'd catch myself unconsciously revving an imaginary throttle or tapping out a familiar rhythm on the steering wheel. A ghost limb twitching from a life I'd sworn to leave behind. That I tried to ignore those urges, to focus on the present, to appreciate the simple pleasures of my new life. But deep down, I knew that the past was never truly gone. It was just lying dormant, waiting for the right spark to ignite it once more. I figured I had a good handle on my past and present, though. That spark, as it turned out, came in the form of three men in ill-fitting polo shirts and clipboards, their faces contorted with self-righteous indignation, their eyes gleaming with a disturbing level of authority. They looked like they had just walked off of a bad sitcom set and were about to ruin my day. They stood on my porch like misplaced chess pieces, blocking the sunlight and radiating an aura of bureaucratic menace. The leader, a portly man with a receding hairline and a name tag that read Gary, cleared his throat with the officiousness of a small-town sheriff. "Ma'am," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "we're here representing the Harmony Glades Homeowners Association. That we've received multiple complaints regarding violations of community standards at this property." I raised an eyebrow, trying to keep my voice even. Violations? I'm pretty sure I'm up to date on everything. I'd even meticulously reviewed the latest HOA newsletter, a document so dry it could suck the moisture out of the Sahara. Gary consulted his clipboard with a theatrical flourish. "Specifically," he said, "we've received complaints about the excessive height of your rose bushes." I blinked. My rose bushes? They're prize-winning roses. I've even won Yard of the Month twice. I couldn't help the defensiveness creeping into my tone. I'd put blood, sweat, and tears, literally, thorns are vicious, into those roses. And, Gary continued, unfazed, the unauthorized placement of lawn gnomes. Unauthorized. There are, like, 20 gnomes on Mrs. Henderson's lawn 2 doors down. She dresses them in seasonal outfits. I gestured wildly. I have three tastefully placed gnomes. One is fishing in a tiny pond, and one is holding a lantern, and another is holding a mushroom. Are they hurting anyone? The other 2 men, who I assumed were Gary's equally uninspired deputies, shifted uncomfortably. Point 1. A skinny guy with a comb-over that defied gravity, actually snorted. Gary shot him a glare. "And," he said, his voice rising slightly, "the egregious display of unconventional garden art." Unconventional. I repeated, my patience wearing thin. "You mean the wind chimes? They're made of recycled motorcycle parts. My neighbor said they're creative." I had to give him that. "Motorcycle parts," Gary said, his nose wrinkling in disgust. That's precisely the problem. This is a family-friendly community. Ma'am, that we have standards to uphold, that we need to maintain the aesthetic. Aesthetic? I scoffed. This is about power, isn't it? You get off on telling people what to do. The simmering anger that had been brewing inside me since they arrived finally bubbled to the surface. Gary's face flushed red. We're just doing our job, ma'am. And if you don't comply with the HOA regulations, we'll be forced to take further action. Further action? I crossed my arms, trying to appear nonchalant, but my heart was starting to pound. What kind of further action? He smirked. Let's just say it could involve fines, legal proceedings, even eviction. Eviction? Over rose bushes and garden gnomes? The absurdity of the situation was almost laughable, but the look in Gary's eyes told me he was serious. This wasn't about aesthetics, that it was about control. And they were trying to bully me. And they were seriously pissing me off that I told them to get off my property, that I told them, in no uncertain terms, that their regulations were ridiculous. Their authority was unwarranted, and their presence was unwelcomed. I even threw in a few choice words I hadn't used. Since my biker days, just for good measure. Gary puffed out his chest, his face now a shade of purple usually reserved for eggplants. You're resisting, he declared, his voice trembling with indignation. You're obstructing official HOA business. Official HOA business. I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. You're harassing me over garden gnomes. This is insane. We're giving you one last chance to comply, Gary said, his eyes narrowing. Remove the offending items, trim the rose bushes, and apologize for your disrespectful behavior. Or what? I challenged, my hands clenching into fists. That's when they made their move. Before I could react, the skinny guy with the comb-over produced a crowbar from. I don't even know where he was hiding it. Seriously, the guy was practically skeletal. Where was he keeping it? He jammed it under the door frame, and with a sickening crack of splintering wood, the door burst inward. That I stumbled back, shocked and disoriented. What the hell are you doing? I yelled, my voice laced with a mixture of fear and fury. Gary stepped into the house, his two goons flanking him like bodyguards. We have the authority, he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. We have the right to enforce the regulations, and if you won't comply willingly. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. We'll have to do it for you. The skinny guy with the crowbar advanced towards me, a predatory gleam in his eyes. The other one, a hulking brute with a neck thicker than my thigh, started rummaging through my living room, tossing books and knickknacks aside with a casual disregard for my belongings. Get out of my house, I screamed, my voice cracking with desperation. That I backed away, trying to put distance between myself and these intruders, but they were relentless, closing in on me like wolves cornering their prey. Gary pointed a finger at me, his face contorted with a sneer. We're going to give you a taste of what happens when you defy the HOA, he said. We're going to teach you a lesson you won't soon forget. He gestured to his goons, and they advanced. That I was trapped, cornered in my own home by these thugs in polo shirts. The world seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in, the air thick with menace. That's when I knew I had no choice. That it was time to call in reinforcements. That it was time to unleash the past I had tried so hard to bury. It was time to remind these suburban bullies that some things are worth fighting for. And some people, you just don't mess with. My hand trembled as I reached for my phone. It felt heavy, alien, in my grasp. The contacts list swam before my eyes, a blur of names and numbers that represented a life I deliberately distanced myself from. I scrolled past the names of my book club friends, the librarian, the friendly cashier at the grocery store, the people who knew me as just another suburbanite. Then I stopped. There it was, a name etched in my memory as deeply as the scars on my own knuckles. Viper. Followed by a number I still knew by heart, a relic from a time when burner phones and encrypted communications were just part of daily life. Calling Viper meant opening a door I'd slammed shut years ago. It meant acknowledging that the past was still a part of me, that the person I used to be was still lurking beneath the surface. It meant risking everything I'd built, everything I'd worked so hard to achieve. But as I looked at the hulking brute tearing apart my bookshelf, as I heard Gary's smug voice echoing in my ears, as I felt the fear creeping into my bones, I knew I didn't have a choice. These guys weren't playing by the rules. they weren't going to listen to reason. They only understood one language. Forced that I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and pressed the call button. The phone rang, each ring a hammer blow against the carefully constructed facade of my new life. I imagined Viper on the other end, probably in some dimly lit garage, surrounded by motorcycles and the smell of oil and gasoline, but I pictured the skeptical look on his face when he saw my number pop up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he answered. Yeah. His voice was gruff, instantly recognizable, sending a shiver down my spine. Viper, it's Raven, I said, my voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause, a silence so profound I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Raven, he finally said, his voice softening slightly. Damn, it's been a minute. What's up? I swallowed hard, trying to find the words to explain the situation without sounding completely insane. I need your help, I said, my voice gaining strength. Some guys, they broke into my house. They're threatening me. Another pause that I could practically feel Viper's eyes narrowing, his mind racing. Who are they? He asked, his voice now laced with a dangerous edge. They say they're with the HOA, I said, feeling ridiculous even saying the words out loud. But I don't think they're legit. HOA, Viper repeated, his voice incredulous. The hell's an HOA? It's complicated, I said. Just can you help me, please? I heard a muffled conversation in the background. Then Viper's voice came back on the line, colder and harder than before. Give me your address. We'll be there in an hour. And then he hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. I had done it. I had crossed the line. I had unleashed the hounds of hell on Harmony Glades. And I had a feeling things were about to get very, very interesting. Raven, that's what they used to call me. Back when I rode with the Iron Serpents. Back when I lived and breathed gasoline, leather, and the open road. Back when rules were just suggestions and authority was something to be challenged. It seems like a lifetime ago now. A different world. A different me. But even after all these years, the memories were still vivid, etched into my mind like tattoos. I remember the first time I saw the Iron Serpents. I was just a kid, running away from a foster home that felt more like a prison. They roared into town on their chrome steeds, a thunderous wave of rebellion and freedom. They were everything I wasn't. Confident, fearless, and unapologetically themselves. Viper, the club's president, saw something in me that no one else ever had. He took me under his wing, taught me how to ride, how to fight, how to survive. He gave me a family, a purpose, a sense of belonging. The Iron Serpents weren't saints, by any means. We ran guns, we dealt drugs, we got into our fair share of brawls, but we also protected the weak, stood up for the downtrodden, and lived by a code of honor that was more binding than any law. Loyalty was everything. Betrayal was unforgivable. I rose through the ranks quickly, earning a reputation for being fearless, resourceful, and fiercely loyal. I was Viper's right hand, his confidant, his enforcer. I was Raven, the serpent's shadow. But the life eventually took its toll. The violence, the paranoia, the constant threat of arrest or death. It wore me down. I started to crave something different, something quieter, something normal. I left. I packed my bags, said goodbye to my brothers and sisters, and rode off into the sunset, leaving Raven behind and hoping to find a new identity. It wasn't easy. I had to learn a whole new set of skills, a whole new way of life. I had to bury the past and create a future. And for a while, it worked. I managed to build a life for myself, a peaceful, respectable life. But the call to Viper proved the past was always there, simmering beneath the surface. Now, waiting for them to arrive, I glanced around my living room, at the shattered remains of my carefully constructed world, the books scattered on the floor, the overturned furniture, the broken door. It was a stark reminder of the chaos I had tried so hard to escape. I knew that when the Iron Serpents arrived, things would never be the same. The quiet, predictable life I had built would be shattered, replaced by the familiar roar of engines and the smell of gasoline. But as I looked at the crowbar lying on the floor, a cold knot of anger tightened in my stomach. Gary and his goons had made their choice. And so had I. Raven was back, and she was ready to ride. The hour crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. The fake HOA goons, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, had become noticeably more subdued. Gary kept glancing nervously at his watch. The skinny guy with the comb-over was practically vibrating with anxiety, and even the hulking brute seemed less enthusiastic about tossing my belongings around. They knew something was coming. They could feel it in the air, the quiet anticipation of a storm. Outside, the sky had darkened, mirroring the mood inside my house. The low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, a fitting soundtrack to the impending arrival of the iron serpents that I used the time to gather my wits and assess the situation. The door was a mess. The living room was trashed, and my nerves were frayed, but I was alive. And soon, I wouldn't be alone. That I remembered one particular incident, years ago, that perfectly encapsulated the Iron Serpent's reputation. That a local businessman, a real piece of work, had been shaking down small businesses in our territory, demanding protection money and threatening violence. The police were useless, turning a blind eye to his activities. The Iron Serpent stepped in. Viper paid the businessman a visit, a quiet, unassuming visit. He didn't threaten him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even lay a hand on him. He simply explained, in a calm, measured tone, that the Iron Serpents wouldn't tolerate such behavior in their territory. That he told him that if he continued to harass the local businesses, he would face consequences. The businessman laughed it off, dismissing Viper as just another biker thug. He made a mistake. The next day, the businessman's office was burned to the ground. Not a single piece of paper survived, and a week later, his prized classic car mysteriously ended up at the bottom of the lake. The businessman got the message. He packed his bags and left town, never to be seen again. That was the Iron Serpents. They didn't always play by the rules, but they always got the job done. They were fiercely protective of their own, and they didn't tolerate injustice. And I, as Raven, was often the one who carried out their justice. That I was the strategist, the planner, the one who could find a weakness in any defense. That I was the whisper in the shadows, the one who made problems disappear. That I had hoped to leave that life behind, to never again have to resort to such tactics. But Gary and his goons had given me no choice. They had threatened my home, my peace, my very existence. And they were about to learn that messing with Raven was a very, very bad idea. The kind of bad idea that ends with a burned-down office or a car at the bottom of a lake. The deep rumble broke the silence, growing louder and louder, closer and closer. It wasn't thunder. It was the unmistakable sound of motorcycle engines. They were here. The Iron Serpents had arrived, and Harmony Glades was about to get a whole lot louder. The rumble grew into a roar, shaking the very foundations of the house. The windows rattled, the pictures on the walls vibrated, and even the fake HOA goons seemed to shrink in stature. They knew. They knew. Outside, the first bikes appeared, gleaming chrome and black leather cutting through the gathering gloom. One by one, they pulled up to the curb, parking with a precision that spoke of years of riding together, of countless miles logged on the open road. Viper was in the lead, of course. His custom-built Harley, a beast of a machine with a skull-shaped headlight and a thunderous exhaust, announced his arrival with a deafening blast. He dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his age, his eyes scanning the scene. With a cold, calculating gaze, he was followed by the rest of the crew, a motley assortment of bikers, each as unique and intimidating as the next. There was Knuckles, a mountain of a man with a shaved head and a face covered in scars. Shadow, a wiry woman with a penchant for knives and a silent, deadly demeanor. And Reaper, a grizzled old-timer with a prosthetic leg and a sawed-off shotgun strapped to his back. They were a force to be reckoned with. A brotherhood forged in fire and loyalty. And they were here for me. I watched them from the window, a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through my veins. It had been years since I had seen them, but they hadn't changed a bit. They were still the same rough, tough, and fiercely loyal crew that I had left behind. Viper walked towards the house, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. He pushed open the broken door, his eyes locking onto mine. "Raven," he said, his voice a low growl. "What the hell happened here?" I gestured to Gary and his goons, who were now huddled together in a corner, looking like frightened rabbits. "They broke in," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "They said they were with the HOA." Viper's eyes narrowed. He turned his gaze on Gary, who immediately began to sweat profusely. "HOA," Viper repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "What in the hell is an HOA?" Before Gary could answer, Knuckles stepped forward, cracking his knuckles menacingly. "Looks like they need a little lesson in respect, boss," he said, his voice a deep rumble. Viper nodded slowly, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "I think you're right, Knuckles," he said. "I think they do." He turned back to me, his expression softening slightly. "You okay, Raven?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Just glad you're here." Viper put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "We always got your back, Raven," he said. "Always." He turned back to Gary and his goons, his eyes blazing with fury. "Now," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Let's talk about what happened here." The air crackled with tension. The storm was about to break, and Harmony Glades was about to learn what happens when you mess with the Iron Serpents. Viper didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He barked a few orders, and the Iron Serpents sprang into action. Knuckles and Shadow strong-armed Gary and his goons out of the house, their protests muffled by the sheer size and menace of their captors. Reaper, ever the pragmatist, started boarding up the broken door with some spare lumber he found in my garage. "Where's the HOA clubhouse?" Viper asked me, his eyes fixed on mine. I pointed in the general direction. "About 5 miles that way," I said. "On Oak Street." Viper nodded. "Let's ride," he said, his lips curling into a grim smile. I hesitated. "Are you sure about this, Viper?" I asked. "This is a bit much, isn't it?" "They broke into your house, Raven," Viper said, his voice hardening. "They threatened you. That's not something we can just let slide." He was right, of course. The Iron Serpents didn't back down from a fight, and they certainly didn't tolerate anyone messing with their own. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay," I said. "Let's do it." I hadn't ridden a motorcycle in years, but the moment I swung my leg over Viper's spare bike, it all came back to me. The feel of the leather beneath my hands, the rumble of the engine between my legs, the wind in my hair. It was like coming home. We roared out of my driveway, a thunderous cavalcade of chrome and steel. The neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of shock and fascination. I could only imagine what they were thinking. As we tore down the quiet suburban streets, the Iron Serpents transformed the landscape. The manicured lawns and pristine houses seemed to shrink in fear as we passed, replaced by a sense of raw power and untamed energy. The sound of our engines echoed through the air, a primal scream that shattered the peaceful facade of Harmony Glades. Dogs barked, car alarms blared, and children pointed and stared as we thundered past. I could feel the eyes of Gary and his goons burning into the back of my head. They were crammed into Shadow's beat-up pickup truck, their faces pale with terror. They knew they were in for a world of hurt. As we approached the HOA clubhouse, the tension grew thicker. The air crackled with anticipation, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a mixture of fear and excitement surging through my veins. I had no idea what was going to happen when we got there, but I knew one thing. The Iron Serpents were about to deliver a lesson in respect that Harmony Glades would never forget. And I, Raven, was going to be right there with them, riding into the storm. The HOA clubhouse was a bland, beige building that looked like it had been designed by a committee of people who had never experienced JOY.IT. Sat in the middle of a perfectly manicured lawn, surrounded by identical flower beds and neatly trimmed hedges. IT was the epitome of suburban conformity. The Iron Serpents, in all their leather-clad glory, were anything but. We pulled up to the curb in a synchronized roar, the engines echoing off the pristine walls of the clubhouse. The bikers dismounted with a practiced ease, their boots thudding heavily on the asphalt. They formed a line in front of the building, a wall of muscle and metal that dared anyone to cross them. Gary and his goons were practically trembling in Shadow's truck. She parked right in front of the clubhouse entrance, blocking the doorway and preventing anyone from leaving or entering. A few bewildered-looking people emerged from the clubhouse, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They were mostly older folks, dressed in khakis and polo shirts, the very embodiment of suburban respectability. They looked utterly out of place facing down a biker gang. Viper stepped forward, his eyes scanning the crowd. "We're looking for the head of this HOA," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried through the air. "We have a little problem to discuss." A woman in a floral dress, who I assumed was the HOA president, hesitantly stepped forward. I'm I'm Beatrice Miller, she stammered. I'm the president of the Harmony Glades Homeowners Association. What seems to be the problem? Viper gestured towards Gary and his goons, who were still cowering in Shadow's truck. These gentlemen, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, broke into my friend's house today. They claimed they were acting on behalf of the HOA. Is that true? Beatrice Miller's eyes widened in shock. What? No. I have no idea what you're talking about. We would never authorize such a thing. That's funny, Viper said, his lips curling into a dangerous smile. Because these guys seemed pretty sure they had the authority to harass my friend over, what was it, Raven? Rose bushes and garden gnomes. A few of the HOA members gasped. Others looked confused, and it was clear that they had no idea what was going on. This is outrageous, Beatrice Miller exclaimed, her voice rising in indignation. I demand that you leave this property immediately. We're calling the police. Viper chuckled. Go ahead and call them, he said. They'll be here all day trying to sort this mess out. In the meantime, we're going to get to the bottom of this. And if these guys aren't who they say they are. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. They're going to regret the day they ever set foot in Harmony Glades. The standoff continued, the tension building with each passing second. The iron serpents stood their ground, a wall of muscle and metal that refused to be intimidated. The HOA members looked on in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. And Gary and his goons, trapped in Shadow's truck, knew that their little charade was about to come crashing down around them. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, or, knowing Shadow, probably did have a knife to cut it with. Viper took a step closer to Shadow's truck, his gaze unwavering. All right, Gary, he said, his voice dangerously soft. Time to tell the truth. Who are you? And why did you break into my friend's house? Gary, sweating bullets, stammered. We're with the HOA. We told you. Viper raised an eyebrow. Oh, really? Beatrice, do you recognize these men? Beatrice Miller peered into the truck, her face etched with confusion. No, she said, shaking her head. I've never seen them before in my life. A collective gasp went through the crowd of HOA members that it was becoming clear that Gary and his goons were not who they claimed to be. Maybe they're new recruits? One of the HOA members suggested, his voice filled with doubt. Viper chuckled. New recruits who break down doors and threaten people over rose bushes? I don't think so. He turned back to Gary, his eyes narrowing. All right, pal, that you've got one last chance. Tell me the truth, or things are going to get very unpleasant for you. Gary, realizing that the jig was up, finally cracked. Okay, he blurted out, his voice trembling. We're not with the HOA. We were hired. Hired? Viper repeated, his voice laced with suspicion. Hired by who? Gary hesitated, glancing nervously at his goons. By Mr. Henderson, he mumbled. Henderson, I repeated, my brow furrowing. Mrs. Henderson's husband? The one with the 20 lawn gnomes? Yeah, that's him, Gary said. He doesn't like you. He thinks you're ruining the neighborhood. Ruining the neighborhood? I scoffed. Because of my wind chimes and rose bushes. He said you were a bad influence, Gary explained. He said you were bringing down property values, that he wanted us to scare you, make you move away. The HOA members gasped again, their faces filled with outrage. It was clear that they were just as shocked and disgusted by Mr. Henderson's actions as I was. So let me get this straight, Viper said, his voice dangerously calm. This guy hired you to break into my friend's house, threaten her, and trash her belongings, all because he didn't like her garden gnomes. Gary nodded, his face buried in his hands. Yeah, he mumbled. That's pretty much it. Viper let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned, he said. That's just pathetic. He turned to Beatrice Miller, his expression hardening. You folks might want to have a little chat with Mr. Henderson. I think he's got some explaining to do. Beatrice Miller nodded, her face grim. We certainly will, she said. This is completely unacceptable. We have rules in this community, but we don't condone violence or intimidation. Mr. Henderson will be hearing from us, and he will face the consequences. The crowd of HOA members murmured in agreement, their faces filled with disapproval. It was clear that Mr. Henderson had just made a lot of enemies. The truth was out. Gary and his goons were exposed as frauds, hired by a petty and vindictive neighbor to harass me. The iron serpents had done their job. Now it was time to deliver the lesson. All right, boys, Viper said, turning his attention back to Gary and his goons. Looks like you made a bad decision today, a very bad decision. He gestured to Knuckles and Shadow, who grinned menacingly. They pulled Gary and his goons out of the truck, their feet dragging on the asphalt. The three men were practically paralyzed with fear, their eyes wide with terror. Now, we're not going to hurt you, Viper said, his voice deceptively calm. We're just going to teach you a little lesson in respect, a lesson about boundaries, and a lesson about the consequences of messing with the wrong people. He turned to the HOA members, who were watching the scene with a mixture of fascination and horror. Don't worry, folks, he said. We're not going to get too carried away. We just want to make sure these guys understand that what they did was wrong, and that they never do it again. What followed was a carefully orchestrated display of intimidation and humiliation. Knuckles, with his massive size and terrifying grin, made Gary and his goons do push-ups on the asphalt, counting out loud in a booming voice that echoed through the neighborhood. Shadow, with her silent and deadly demeanor, confiscated their clipboards and pens, snapping them in half with her bare hands. Reaper, meanwhile, took a can of bright pink spray paint and proceeded to decorate their car with a variety of colorful slogans, including, "I break into houses," and "I harass people over garden gnomes." He even added a few artistic touches, like a drawing of a lawn gnome with a sad face. The HOA members watched in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Some of them even started to chuckle. It was clear that they were enjoying the show. Now, Viper said, once the lesson was complete, I think we've made our point. Gary, I want you and your friends to get in your car and drive out of Harmony Glades, and I don't ever want to see your faces around here again. Do you understand? Gary nodded frantically, his face streaked with sweat and tears. Yes, we understand. We're leaving. We're never coming back. He and his goons scrambled into their car, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. They started the engine and sped away, leaving a trail of pink spray paint and humiliation in their wake. The Iron Serpents watched them go, their faces grim. They had delivered their message. They had set an example, and they had made it clear that Harmony Glades was no longer a safe haven for bullies and thugs. Viper turned back to me, his expression softening. You okay, Raven? He asked that I nodded, a smile spreading across my face. Yeah, I said. I'm okay. Thanks, Viper. I really appreciate it. Anytime, Raven, Viper said. Anytime. He turned to the HOA members, his voice becoming more formal. We apologize for the disruption, folks, he said. We just wanted to make sure that these guys got what they deserved. We hope you understand. Beatrice Miller stepped forward, her face filled with gratitude. We do, she said. Thank you for taking care of this. We're very grateful. The Iron Serpents had delivered their lesson. They had restored order to Harmony Glades, and they had reminded everyone that even in the most peaceful of communities, there's always room for a little bit of biker justice. With Gary and his goons gone and the immediate threat neutralized, the atmosphere at the HOA clubhouse shifted. The tension dissipated, replaced by a sense of relief and a nervous sort of energy. The HOA members, still reeling from the events of the afternoon, began to chatter. Amongst themselves, their voices a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a surprising amount of amusement. Beatrice Miller, still looking a bit flustered, approached Viper and me. I don't even know what to say, she stammered. This is the most excitement we've had in Harmony Glades in, well, ever. Viper chuckled. Just glad we could help, ma'am, he said, tipping his head slightly. But, your methods, Beatrice continued, her brow furrowing. They were unconventional, to say the least. We get results, Viper said, his voice unapologetic. Beatrice sighed. I suppose you do, she said. But I can't condone violence or intimidation. It's just not the way we do things in Harmony Glades. We understand, I said, stepping forward. But sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, and sometimes you need a little bit of muscle to get your point across. Beatrice looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. I suppose you're right, she said. And I am grateful. You exposed those men for who they were, and you stopped them from doing any more harm. And for that, I thank you. She paused, taking a deep breath. But I also have to say, she continued, that I'm a little worried. What if this gets out? What if the police get involved? What if Mr. Henderson sues us? Don't worry about it, ma'am, Viper said, his voice reassuring. We'll take care of everything. Just leave it to us. Beatrice hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay, she said. I trust you. She turned to the other HOA members, her voice becoming more assertive. All right, everyone, she said. Let's get back to the clubhouse and discuss what to do about Mr. Henderson. This is completely unacceptable, and he will be held accountable for his actions. The HOA members, energized by the events of the afternoon, nodded in agreement and began to file back into the clubhouse. It was clear that they were ready to take action as the HOA members disappeared inside. Viper turned to me, his eyes filled with concern. You sure you're okay, Raven? He asked. This must have been a shock. I'm fine, Viper, I said, forcing a smile. It was a little crazy, but I'm glad it's over, and I'm grateful for your help. Anytime, Viper said. Just remember, you can always count on us. He paused, his expression becoming more serious. But Raven, he said, are you sure you want to stay here? In this Stepfordville? I hesitated, glancing around at the perfectly manicured lawns and the identical houses. It was a far cry from the life I used to live, but it was also the life I had chosen. I don't know, Viper, I said. I like it here. It's peaceful, that it's safe, and it's normal. Normal, Viper repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. Is that what you really want, Raven? To be normal? I looked at him, my heart filled with doubt. Was I truly happy here, or was I just pretending? Was I running away from my past, or was I embracing my future? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing. I wasn't ready to give up yet. I wasn't ready to let Mr. Henderson or Gary or anyone else drive me away from the life I had built. I don't know, I said, but I'm going to try it. I'm going to give it a shot. Viper nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. All right, Raven, he said. We'll be here if you need us. Just give us a call. He clapped me on the shoulder, then turned to his crew. All right, boys, he said. Let's ride. The Iron Serpents revved their engines and prepared to leave as they pulled out of the parking lot. The sound of their engines echoed through the neighborhood, a final reminder that even in the most peaceful of communities, there's always a little bit of chaos lurking beneath the surface. The Iron Serpents disappeared down Oak Street, their engines fading into the distance, leaving behind a stunned silence and a lingering scent of gasoline. I stood there for a moment, watching them go, my heart filled with a strange mixture of relief and sadness. It was good to see them, to feel that connection again. But it was also a reminder of the life I had left behind, a life that was both exciting and dangerous, fulfilling and ultimately unsustainable. I turned back to my house. The broken door and trashed living room a stark reminder of the events of the afternoon. It was going to take a lot of work to put things back together, both physically and emotionally, but I knew I could do it. I had faced worse in my life, and I had always come out on top. As I started to clean up the mess, a few of the HOA members approached me, their faces filled with concern. Are you sure you're all right? One of them asked. Is there anything we can do to help? I'm fine, I said, forcing a smile. But thanks for asking. I appreciate it. They offered to help with the cleanup, and I gratefully accepted. Together, we boarded up the broken door, gathered the scattered books, and righted the overturned furniture. It was slow, tedious work, but it was also therapeutic. It was a way of reclaiming my space, of asserting my control over my life. As the sun began to set, the HOA members finished their work and prepared to leave. We're going to have a meeting with Mr. Henderson tomorrow, Beatrice Miller said, her voice firm. He will be held accountable for his actions. I promise you that. Thank you, I said. I appreciate your support. The HOA members left, leaving me alone in my house. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but it was also peaceful, and it was mine. I spent the rest of the evening cleaning, organizing, and trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to my life. As I worked, I couldn't help but think about Viper's words. Are you sure you want to stay here? In this Stepfordville? I didn't have an answer, but I knew that I wasn't going to let anyone, not Mr. Henderson, not Gary, not even Viper, make that decision for me. I was going to stay in Harmony Glades, at least for now, and I was going to make it work. As I finally crawled into bed, exhausted but satisfied, I heard a faint rumble outside. I peeked through the window and saw two motorcycles parked across the street, their riders silhouetted in the moonlight. It was Shadow and Knuckles, They were there to keep an eye on things to make sure that Mr. Henderson or anyone else didn't try anything funny. That I smiled, that I wasn't completely alone, that I had friends in high places, friends who would always have my back, and that made all the difference. That I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep. The faint rumble of motorcycle engines a comforting lullaby. Harmony Glades might be a little bit more interesting now. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of roses blooming. That I went outside and surveyed my garden, my heart filled with a sense of peace and contentment. The wind chimes were tinkling gently in the breeze, and the garden gnomes were standing guard over my prized roses. That I had faced a threat, and I had overcome it. I had called upon my past, and I had emerged stronger than ever. And I had learned that even in the most peaceful of communities, there's always room for a little bit of Raven. And that was okay. More than okay. That was life, and it was good.